On a bustling Saturday evening, golden lights spilled gloriously across the grand facade of Aurora Fine Dining, the most prestigious restaurant in Beverly Hills. Amid the shimmering crystals and rare vintage wines, Hollywood's most powerful figures raised their glasses, trading stories where even a single nod could be worth millions of dollars. The revolving door turned. A man stepped inside, worn leather jacket, scuffed boots, hair hanging loose as if untouched by a comb. He moved quietly, unhurried, yet without hesitation. In a place where every footstep echoed with confidence and prestige, Gabriel Hart entered like a scratch across a perfect painting. Instantly, a judgmental glance was cast his way. Marcus Denton, a veteran waiter recently promoted to shift manager, stood near the reception desk. His eyes scanned from the man's messy hair to the frayed hem of his jacket, finally resting on Gabriel's cracked leather shoes. A smirk flickered across his face. No questions asked. No need to know more, Marcus had already concluded. Not one of us. He whispered to Daniel, the new employee. Another one who doesn't know where he is. Watch and learn how I handle this. And then the confrontation began. Marcus approached like a king who had just spotted an intruder in his palace. He stepped in front of Gabriel, his smile cold, like a blade slicing through the thin veil of politeness. "Good evening, sir. You're not lost, are you?" Gabriel looked up, his gaze calm, eerily so. "No, I'm here for dinner." Marcus scoffed the smirk of someone who believed he had full control of the situation. Aurora is a fine dining establishment. We serve people of a certain standard. I'm not sure this is the right place for you. A few glances from around the restaurant began to drift their way, curious or contemptuous. Gabriel didn't show a flicker of anger. Just a faint smile, followed by a question that seemed to drop a hush over the room. "Are you saying I'm not welcome here?" A pause. Then Marcus, slipping comfortably into the role he'd grown used to playing, stepped forward, leaned in slightly, and spoke just loud enough for a few nearby tables to hear. "To be honest, sir, you might want to find somewhere with more reasonable prices. Here, just the appetizer costs more than some people's rent." What he didn't know was he had just stepped into a game of chess where his opponent wasn't a poor man. He also didn't know the man standing before him didn't need a tie or a luxury car to assert his power. And even more so, he had no idea that tonight, a single napkin, a glass of water spilled on a lap, and one name would completely alter the course of his career and change how this restaurant viewed the true worth of a human being. Aurora Fine Dining, a place where every corner table held a billion-dollar story, and every seat was a privilege reserved for names that carried weight. The walls were clad in Italian marble, and Swarovski crystal chandeliers floated above like stars suspended in a frame of opulence. A single glance from someone in that room could land you a leading role or cost you an entire investment deal. In that world, Marcus Denton was a long-time server recently promoted to shift manager just 3 weeks ago. He loved this restaurant not just for the generous salary or the crisply pressed uniforms, but because here, Marcus felt he had the power to decide who was worthy of a seat and who was just an outsider. Marcus had once been a nobody raised in a working-class neighborhood, surrounded by mocking laughter and dreams that were crushed before they could grow. And now, with every bow as he poured wine for a celebrity, he felt he was settling a debt with life by showing disdain to anyone who reminded him of who he used to be. And that was exactly why Gabriel Hart, the man who entered with such quiet simplicity, became a thorn in Marcus's side. Gabriel was unlike anyone who had ever set foot in Aurora. No tie, no reservation, no attempt to appear connected. He simply existed as if his very stillness was what filled the room. He took a seat at the table near the kitchen, the one Marcus deliberately assigned to humiliate him. Next to it were trays of food waiting to be served, the faint smell of oil in the air, and the clatter of cutlery each time the kitchen door swung open. And yet, Gabriel sat still, as if none of the extravagance around him had ever mattered. No complaints, no leaving, no bowing his head. A few meters away, Victor Gray, a renowned real estate investor, was sipping red wine beside his wife. Lila, a gentle yet sharp-witted social activist. They were regulars at Aurora. And Victor smirked almost instantly when he saw Marcus educating the strange guest. Guys like him are just looking for trouble. If you can't afford it, you shouldn't walk in, Victor muttered. But Lila said nothing. She quietly observed Gabriel, his eyes, the way he held the menu with both hands, careful and composed. A man like that didn't seem like someone trying to stir up conflict. He looked more like someone who had lived through things far bigger than a meal. At a corner table by the window overlooking the fountain, Charles Wynne sat alone. His silver hair and deep blue suit made him stand out, even without speaking, a seasoned businessman in the finance world. Charles had the kind of gaze only those who'd lost everything and rebuilt it could carry sharp. But calm. He took a sip of wine, then glanced at Gabriel, his eyes recognizing something familiar. Not the man's appearance, but the stillness within the noise. A feeling Charles had once carried as a young man when he too had been kicked out of a restaurant for not wearing the right jacket. Everyone else might have moved on, but Marcus still saw nothing beyond the frayed coat and dust-covered shoes. In his mind, this was a perfectly staged punishment bringing an unworthy man back to where he belonged. But what he didn't know was Gabriel Hart. The man who remained calm amid the storm was actually the secret co-owner of Aurora. And tonight, he hadn't come just for dinner, he came to witness a truth unfold, whether people still remembered what respect looked like. When there was no spotlight to blind them, Marcus approached the table with a face that suggested he was bestowing mercy, arms crossed and a thin, calculated smile on his lips. Marcus planted himself right in front of Gabriel. A few curious glances began to drift in their direction, not because of Gabriel's presence, but because of Marcus's posture, so polished it bordered on arrogant. "Good evening, sir," Marcus said, his voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I'm afraid you may be in the wrong place." Gabriel looked up, eyes meeting eyes. No anger, no discomfort, just silence, as if he were seeing straight through a performance. "I believe I'm in the right place. I'd like to have dinner." Marcus tilted his head, one brow raised. He tried to keep his voice even, but contempt had already started to leak through every word. "Of course," Marcus said. "It's just that Aurora is the kind of place where guests typically make a reservation. And your name isn't on the list. Gabriel's expression didn't change. I don't mind waiting. Marcus let out a soft chuckle, a laugh with no trace of joy. Certainly. But just so you're aware, this isn't your neighborhood family diner. We have standards. His eyes slid over Gabriel's worn leather jacket, pausing at the scuffed boots and the unbranded watch on his wrist. For instance, dark tailored jackets, Italian leather shoes. A Patek Philippe watch, not the kind you're wearing, Marcus added, this time not even bothering to hide the mockery in his tone. Gabriel tilted his head slightly, his voice low but firm. And those standards, what are they measured by? By fabric or by how we treat others? The question stopped Marcus for a second, just long enough for a few nearby guests to glance over, one even raising an intrigued eyebrow. But Marcus quickly slipped back into character, replying in a lowered voice, "I'm only trying to spare you the feeling of being out of place." Marcus said, "This is a place where class is demonstrated, not faked." Gabriel smiled this time, a smile with sharper edges. "I don't feel out of place. Perhaps I just don't resemble the kind of people who think class comes from a bank card." The words made Marcus tighten his grip on the menu. He glanced behind him, catching Daniel, the new hire, quietly watching, his face pale with tension. "Fine," Marcus said, the words hissing through clenched teeth. "If you insist on dining, I'll find you a suitable table." Marcus led Gabriel to a table by the kitchen entrance, dimly lit, close to the stainless steel trash bin and the swinging doors where chefs rushed in and out, the kind of seat reserved for guests they hoped wouldn't return. "This table is very quiet," Marcus said in a voice as syrupy as it was cold, perfect for someone with a discreet style. He placed the menu on the table with a soft but pointed thud, loud enough to make a statement, then flashed a dangerous smile. "Enjoy your meal, sir, assuming you can cover the bill." Gabriel glanced around. The space was dim, the clinking of dishes from the nearby kitchen ringing constantly. But instead of frowning, he simply said, softly, "Thank you. I think tonight will be quite memorable." Marcus turned away, smiling smugly, proud of himself. But from across the room, Charles Wynne set his wineglass down with a soft clink. Lila touched hers, but didn't drink. Victor glanced at his wife and shrugged, as if to say, "It's nothing." Yet still, each of them felt something strange in the air. That man wasn't leaving, and he wasn't bowing his head. In a place that worshipped appearance like doctrine, wasn't that a silent act of defiance? In the shadowy corner near the kitchen, where the golden glow of chandeliers couldn't quite reach, Gabriel sat still. In contrast to the buzz of the grand hall, his seat was surrounded by the clang of silverware, the constant slam of swinging doors, and the head chef yelling in rapid-fire Italian. But Gabriel didn't seem the least bit bothered. He opened the menu, reading each line with focus. The way he held it gentle, deliberate, looked more like someone reading a handwritten letter than glancing at a list of the city's most expensive dishes. From a distance, Marcus stood beside the bar, sneaking glances toward Gabriel. "He's still not leaving," Marcus muttered through gritted teeth, his expression starting to shift. Daniel, the young employee, gave a small nod. "He's just reading the menu." Marcus pressed his lips tight. In nearly 10 years of serving, he'd never seen anyone like this man. The ones who dressed like that usually backed out at the door, or at least avoided eye contact. But this one, he sat with his back straight, his eyes calm, his presence so natural it made Marcus feel threatened. "Give him 5 more minutes. He'll walk out once he sees the prices," Marcus said, the mocking smile returning. 5 minutes passed. Gabriel didn't leave. 10 minutes passed. Gabriel folded the menu and set it down. No sign of retreat. No bowing of the head. Just steadiness, a kind of strength completely foreign in the world Marcus was used to controlling. Marcus clenched his fists, and this time he had no intention of staying polite. He walked over to the table, carrying a pitcher of ice water, and in a moment that seemed almost accidental, he tilted his hand, pouring a stream of cold water right onto Gabriel's lap. The water spilled over the table's edge, soaking into Gabriel's jeans, dripping onto the tiled floor like a strike against dignity. A few nearby guests gasped softly. Daniel, standing near the service station, widened his eyes in stunned silence. "Oh, my apologies, sir," Marcus said, his voice honey-sweet. But his eyes were cold as steel. Things like this tend to happen when we're busy tending to real guests. He set the pitcher down with a deliberate, sharp thud. Gabriel looked down at his drenched pants, then back up at Marcus. Still, no anger. Instead, he simply picked up a napkin and gently dabbed the wet fabric. "It's all right," he said. "Accidents happen." A beat. Then he looked up slowly. "Although, I'm starting to think this particular accident feels rather intentional." He didn't speak loudly, but it was loud enough for the table next to him, where Lila sat, to hear. She glanced over, her brow furrowing. Marcus forced a stiff smile. "Please, don't take it the wrong way," Marcus said. His tone dipped in false courtesy. "But honestly, I think you should leave before this becomes more embarrassing for you." And then his voice shifted completely into open mockery. "Aurora has standards. We don't serve those who disrupt the sense of luxury for others." The air in the room began to tighten. Several guests turned their heads. Charles Wynne, the elder gentleman in the blue suit, set his wineglass down for the second time, his eyes now fixed with purpose. Gabriel calmly folded the napkin and placed it back on the table. Then he leaned gently against the back of his chair, still looking at Marcus with the steady calm of someone facing a very small test. "You think I should be embarrassed?" Gabriel asked, voice even and low. "I only came to have dinner. There's only one person turning this into a spectacle, and I think you know who that is." Marcus froze for a few seconds. For the first time since Gabriel walked in, he wasn't in control, but still, he tried to cling to the upper hand. Then, "Order," Marcus snapped. "Just know, the most expensive item on our menu might exceed the credit limit on your card." Gabriel didn't flinch. Just a small nod. "Good. I'll have the foie gras Rossini." Marcus froze. That dish, priced at $350, was one of the most luxurious items on Aurora's menu. Do you know how much that costs?" Marcus asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "I do," Gabriel replied, "and I still want it. Also, if possible, could you bring me a dry napkin in that moment for the first time?" Marcus had no words. Gabriel, the man he had judged as unworthy, had just dismantled every assumption with the one language Marcus understood best: confidence that needed no validation. But what Marcus didn't know was that this was only the warm-up. Because the man sitting across from him wasn't just a guest. He was someone who held the power to change Marcus's life, starting tonight. Marcus turned from the table, gripping the order pad like someone who had just lost a chess match but refused to admit it. Behind him, Gabriel sat in near-invincible calm, a stillness so unnerving it could make even the most aggressive opponent feel threatened. At a table not far away, Victor turned to Leela, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "This guy's more stubborn than a tick," Victor muttered. "Still, no way he'll make it to dessert." But Leela didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the man in the faded jacket, not because of how he looked, but because of the unwavering resolve in his gaze, in the far corner. Charles Wynne casually swirled his wineglass, taking a small sip, but his eyes were tracking Marcus's every move. Moments later, Marcus returned not with food, nor with water, but with the bill. He placed the leather folder on the table with a loud thud, then tapped it twice with his fingertip, a gesture usually reserved for those suspected of skipping out. "I think it's best we clarify things up front," Marcus said, his tone syrupy, but his stare sharp as a blade. "Here, the minimum tip is 20%, and we don't cater to guests who are just trying things out." Gabriel didn't flinch. He picked up the bill folder, opened it, and examined each line item, completely unfazed by the condescending tone. Then, from inside his jacket, he pulled out a metallic black card, its logo gleaming, a symbol of status possessed by only a few thousand people in the world. Marcus froze. A twitch flickered in his eye. But before he could say a word, a voice called out from behind. "Excuse me." Richard, the senior manager of Aurora, rushed over with a tight expression. His grey suit was perfectly pressed down to the last fold, but his face was strung tight like a pulled wire. He stopped beside the table and bowed slightly. "Mr. Hart, I deeply apologize for what has happened. Had we known you'd be joining us tonight, we would have prepared." The entire restaurant fell silent. Marcus stood rooted in place. The curious looks from diners shifted into sheer disbelief. Someone at a nearby table whispered aloud, "Hart," as in, that Hart Gabriel gently closed the bill folder and placed it on the table. His face showed nothing but a faint smile, yet that was the moment the atmosphere inside Aurora began to fracture, layer by layer. No need for anything special. "Richard," he said, "I just wanted to experience the place, as a regular guest." At that moment, Richard glanced at Marcus, and that look alone felt like a verdict. "Marcus," he said, "Mr. Hart is a co-owner of the Aurora Group, and of course, his meal will be on the house." The words rang out like a bell tolling through the dining room, and Marcus went pale. He stepped back half a pace, his mouth opening to say something, but no sound came. Gabriel looked him straight in the eyes for the first time, a trace of ice beneath the calm. "Before you walk away, I think we need to talk." No shouting, no raised voice, but no one dared interrupt. Gabriel leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, and asked like a teacher speaking to a student who had crossed a line, "Marcus, what made you think I wasn't worthy of sitting here?" Marcus stammered, his lips trembling. I I didn't know. You didn't know I was the owner, didn't know I had money, or didn't know I was a human being worthy of respect. No one in the restaurant dared to speak. Lila placed her hand gently on Victor's. He was silent for the first time. Charles set down his wineglass. His gaze was deep like a canyon. Gabriel leaned back slightly, but his voice remained steady and clear. You think wearing a suit gives you the right to decide who belongs here. You've forgotten dignity doesn't come from a jacket. Richard remained still, his full attention now fixed on Gabriel. But Gabriel wasn't finished. He stood. For the first time that evening he rose to his feet and suddenly seemed to tower above them all. I'm not firing you tonight, Marcus. Instead, I have a test for you. And if you pass it, I'll be the one to apologize. Marcus swallowed hard. His eyes looked as though they had fallen into an abyss. Gabriel smiled, but this time it was the smile of someone holding another's fate in his hands. You're going to serve a group of guests who, by your standards, don't belong here, for 1 hour. If you treat them with the same respect you think you deserve, you keep your job. If not, you leave. Marcus stood frozen. There were no words that could save him from the blow he'd just been dealt. The entire restaurant, from the most powerful guests to the servers on staff, held their breath. The silence inside Aurora now hung as heavy as a stone, pressing on everyone's chest. Gabriel Hart, in his worn jacket and scuffed boots, now stood like a conductor on the stage of his own theatre. I've invited a few friends, they'll be here in 10 minutes, he said, his voice as precise as a Swiss timepiece. None of them are wearing suits. None of them hold membership cards. And they might not know how to pronounce the names of the wines correctly. But you will serve them for 1 hour, kindly, professionally, as if they were CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Gabriel paused for a beat, then finished. If you can do that, you stay. If not, you leave. Simple. Marcus managed a slight nod, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of the entire room's gaze pressing down on his shoulders. Victor, who had earlier mocked Gabriel, now sat upright, speechless. Lila, for the first time that evening, smiled, just a little. Charles Wynne, the seasoned businessman, lifted his wineglass toward Gabriel, saying nothing, but offering everything through his gaze. 10 minutes passed. The restaurant doors swung open. 6 guests walked in, 3 men, 3 women. None of them looked like Aurora's typical clientele. One man wore an old flannel shirt, paint still smudged on his hands. A middle-aged woman had on a denim jacket from a decade past. A young man in a hoodie and worn-out sneakers looked like he had just stepped out of a fast food joint and stumbled into a high-society gala. Marcus stared at them like a nightmare coming to life. Gabriel took a seat at the central table Richard had arranged right in the heart of the restaurant, where the chandelier's crystal light shone down like a Broadway spotlight. He crossed his arms and said nothing, just stared at Marcus, waiting to see how he'd begin. Marcus swallowed hard, then stepped toward the group. Each step felt like walking barefoot over glass. Good evening, he forced a smile, but it came out crooked. Please follow me to your table. He led them past the main dining area where several other guests watched like spectators at a play. Some whispered, some raised their brows. Marcus pulled out each chair, his hands trembling slightly. He set the menus down and offered a strained smile. "Please, take a look at the menu. I'll be back shortly." Less than 3 minutes later. One of the women, the one in the denim jacket, raised her hand. "Excuse me, what's the difference between the truffle risotto and the regular risotto?" Marcus squinted, exhaustion starting to mix with disdain. If you have to ask that, then the price probably doesn't matter much to you," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. The entire table froze. The mood dropped. The man in the flannel shirt let out a small laugh, half genuine, half biting. "Service here is certainly something." Marcus clenched his order pad, trying to swallow his frustration. He walked away, but before he could get far, a voice cut through the air. Gabriel's voice. "Is there a problem with that question, Marcus?" Marcus turned back, lips pressed tight. "No, sir." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "Because I remember. That was the same question I asked the first time I tried it." Marcus didn't reply. He turned around, but his shoulders had dropped. This was only the beginning. The clock had started ticking. And for the next hour, Marcus Denton, the man who once believed he had the authority to define class, would face something he had never prepared for, serving the very people he had deemed unworthy, with kindness. Marcus returned to the table, his eyes dark, like a cornered animal. He took a deep breath, trying to suppress the fury boiling in his chest. But the stares surrounding him from the VIP tables, from Manager Richard, and most of all, from Gabriel Hart, were like spotlights shining on the cracks spreading through his mask. He bowed slightly toward the group of 6, these special guests he never imagined he'd be serving. "We're ready to order," said the man in the hoodie, a mischievous glint in his smile. Marcus raised his pen, eyes fixed on the order pad. "Go ahead," he said flatly. "I'll have the foie gras rossini," the man continued, his eyes lifting slightly. "Heard it's the house specialty." Marcus froze. His pen stopped mid-air. "Excuse me," he asked, brows furrowed. "I said, the foie gras rossini," the man repeated, more clearly this time, his gaze sharper. "Same dish Mr. Hart ordered earlier." A silence dropped over the table. Marcus scoffed, any trace of politeness now gone. "Do you know how much that dish costs?" The man nodded. "I do." Marcus shook his head, chuckling bitterly. "I think it would save us all some time if you picked something a little more realistic. Something regular guests order, like a salad, maybe." As soon as the words left his mouth, the table fell still. A brief moment of disbelief. Then the atmosphere turned thick. The middle-aged woman who had earlier asked about the risotto sat motionless. Her eyes weren't angry. They were disappointed. "Are you suggesting we can't afford what we ordered?" she asked softly. Marcus rolled his eyes, his voice slipping out of control. "I'm saying some places aren't meant for everyone, and this is one of those places." At that very moment, a gentle clink rang out from the center of the restaurant. Gabriel Hart stood up. He walked toward the table like a judge descending from the panel, each step slow, deliberate, and somehow heavier than the last. With every stride, Marcus's heartbeat thudded harder against his chest. "Is there a problem?" Gabriel asked, his voice low but cuttingly clear. Marcus turned, face pale. I was just doing my job." "Sir," Gabriel tilted his head, "doing your job by advising guests to order cheaper items because you assume they can't afford more," Marcus stammered. They just didn't look like the kind of people who order that." Gabriel paused. Then he turned to the group, his gaze softening. "My apologies for the inconvenience. Tonight, dinner is on me. Order whatever you'd like." The man in the hoodie smiled, nodding. "Thanks. Gabriel, I'll stick with the foie gras rossini." Marcus blinked. "Gabriel. You know Mr. Hart?" The man gently pulled back the hood, revealing a face both sharp and unmistakably familiar in the culinary world. Defined features, piercing eyes that had appeared in countless magazine profiles and high-end food reviews. "My name is Jonathan Price," the man said, "food critic for Gourmet Insider." Marcus reeled. The entire restaurant seemed to tremble, just slightly. Several guests whispered. One let out a deep breath. Charles Wynne chuckled softly, not loud enough to echo, but heavy with meaning. Jonathan continued, this time locking eyes with Marcus. "And you've just turned this dinner into a very special article. A story about bias, exclusion, and how a man in a worn-out jacket showed more dignity than the one hired to serve." Marcus stood frozen. His hands trembled. Sweat began to bead on his temples. Gabriel didn't need to say anything more. He simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, gaze like a verdict, quiet, but absolute. "The hour's not over. Marcus," he said softly, "but I think your lesson has already begun." Marcus remained rooted, eyes wide and unblinking, as if he had just witnessed a crash, one that he had caused. Around him, every face in the restaurant was turned his way, judging, stunned, some quietly disappointed. In front of him, Jonathan Price, the celebrated food critic, sat sipping his wine with a calm so cold it felt cruel. And at the center of it all stood Gabriel Hart, the man Marcus had looked down on from the very first moment, tall, silent, but with a gaze sharp enough to cut. Not a single word was spoken during what felt like the longest seconds of Marcus's life. Finally, Gabriel stepped forward, calm, without anger, without vengeance, only something deeper, something weightier. "You know, Marcus," he began, voice low and steady, "you don't need to be fired to realize you were wrong. Sometimes being kept is the harder punishment." Marcus pressed his lips together, unable to lift his head, but Gabriel continued, "You were wrong, but mistakes aren't the end if you learn something from them." He paused, glancing around the restaurant where even the VIPs now sat silent, like students caught in a moral lesson. "I won't fire you," Gabriel said. "Instead, I have an offer, a chance either for forgiveness or your final lesson." Marcus looked up, his lips trembling. "What is it?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel didn't raise his tone. He didn't build suspense. He simply spoke as if offering a real human chance. "Starting tomorrow, you'll report to a place I founded, a small restaurant downtown. No luxury, no crystal chandeliers, just people, some formerly homeless, others rebuilding their lives and hot meals served daily. Marcus's eyes widened, thinking he'd misheard. Gabriel nodded. It's called Second Table. I started it to serve those society often labels as belonging nowhere. You'll serve them, listen to them, understand them, and if, after 1 month, you truly change, you can return to Aurora. No one in the restaurant laughed. No one interrupted. Even Richard, the seasoned manager, stood tall, his eyes softer now. Or, Gabriel continued, if you believe that place isn't meant for you, you can walk out tonight. No one will stop you, but you'll lose more than just a job. Marcus stared at him, and for the first time that night, there was a flicker in his eyes of something human, not superiority, not victimhood, but a man who had just realized he was wrong and was now deciding whether to step beyond the boundaries of his own pride. Gabriel slowly stepped back, his gaze never leaving Marcus. The choice is yours, he said gently, but I hope you'll choose right. The entire restaurant remained silent. Charles Wynne lifted his wineglass, touching it lightly to his lips. Lila reached for Victor's hand. He no longer held his chin high, but lowered his gaze, like someone waking from the dream of superiority. Marcus stood there, heart in disarray like a kitchen after the rush. He didn't know what hurt more, being humiliated, or being forgiven by someone he once considered beneath him. And then, I'll go, Marcus said quietly. 2. Second table. Gabriel nodded. Good. First shift starts at 5 a.m. Wear a plain shirt. No one there cares what you wear. The only thing they care about is whether or not you mean it. A month passed. No more crystal chandeliers. No more white tablecloths. No $1,000 wines or customers flashing Rolexes. Only second table remained, a modest space tucked beneath the shadow of an old church, with weathered wooden doors, the scent of hot soup drifting from the kitchen, and laughter mingled with the sound of tired sighs. There, Marcus Denton began again, not from the bottom of his career, but from the beginning of his heart. Every morning, he arrived by 5 a.m., wiping tables, washing dishes, preparing hot meals for the homeless, the unemployed, struggling students, and those who had long lost faith in kindness. On the first day, Marcus said little. He just worked. Mechanically, his movements clumsy, his eyes avoiding contact. He couldn't even remember the names of the first guests he served. But then, on the third day, a boy about 10 years old walked in wearing a sweater with a torn shoulder, face smudged with dirt, following his mother to receive a bowl of chicken porridge. The boy looked up at Marcus, smiled, and said, "Mister, you cut the bread really nice." Just that. Not a critique, not a judgment. Simply a look without contempt. Marcus looked down at his hands, the same hands that once served the rich, that once poured water on a guest out of foolish pride, now being complimented by a child for the way he sliced bread. From that moment on, something in him began to shift. He started remembering names. He learned that the elderly man in the corner preferred his soup without pepper, that the young woman recently divorced drank unsweetened hot cocoa because it reminded her of her mother. He began looking people in the eye, not to judge, but to truly see them, to see the story behind the face. And then, one afternoon, while scrubbing down a stack of large soup pots at the end of his shift, Marcus realized he had never felt this needed before. Not because of power, not because of a pressed uniform, but because he was finally serving for something greater than himself. When the probation month ended, Marcus was called back to Aurora. He didn't wear a suit, just a plain white shirt, slacks, and a smile. That was real. Aurora fine dining hadn't changed, still filled with luxury. Glittering lights, and the clink of glasses over million-dollar deals. But the man standing at the host's podium that evening was no longer the Marcus Denton of old. Richard, the restaurant manager, stepped out to greet him with a slight nod. "Mr. Hart is expecting you." Marcus walked into the lobby, not with the pounding fear of before, but with the nervous anticipation of a student about to turn in their final exam. Gabriel Hart sat at the center table, no longer wearing the old jacket, but still those same eyes deep, still observant. "Welcome back, Marcus," he said. Marcus stood tall. "I'm on time." Gabriel gave a slight nod. "And it seems you've arrived as the right man." Then he reached into his pocket and placed an envelope on the table. "This is your confirmation letter. You're welcome back at Aurora under a new title." Marcus opened it. His eyes paused on the line. "Mentor, training manager at second table, permanent contract." Gabriel smiled. "You don't need to return to this restaurant unless you're coming as a guest. You've found the place where you belong, and I believe they need you more than I do." A breath caught in Marcus's chest, not from surprise, but because for the first time in his life someone trusted him enough to hand over real responsibility, not because of how he looked, but because of who he had become. That evening, as Marcus stepped out of Aurora, he didn't carry a termination notice but a genuine chance at rebirth, and no one inside the restaurant could remain unaffected. A strange silence settled over the space, not from confusion, but from introspection. Everyone, in their own way, was reassessing themselves. At the VIP table, Victor and Lila Gray sat across from each other. Victor, the man who once mocked Gabriel as someone unfit to even set foot in Aurora, now found himself unable to offer a single excuse. His collar felt tighter, and the wineglass before him, long emptied, remained untouched. Lila looked at her husband, her eyes soft yet unwavering. "I told you once," she said gently. "Class doesn't come from a suit." Victor lowered his head, nodding slowly. "I know," he whispered, "and for the first time, I truly feel ashamed. Not because of Marcus, but because he had laughed with Marcus, encouraged his contempt for others, without once realizing he was complicit in cruelty." Lila reached across and touched his hand. "The important thing is, you realized it." At the bar, Charles Wynne, the silver-haired businessman, stood up and walked slowly toward Richard. Richard was still stunned. Everything that had happened that evening had shaken the very foundation of the system he'd managed for over a decade, from how staff were hired to how service etiquette was taught. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Hart," Charles said. "About second table." Richard raised his brows, surprised. "You'd like to invest?" Charles gave a small shake of the head. "Not invest, repay." Then, in a quiet voice, he began to share. "Many years ago, I was kicked out of a restaurant just for dressing too simply. My name wasn't on the reservation list. I still remember how it felt, like I'd been erased from the map of humanity. But someone stepped in and brought me back to the table. Today, I saw the same thing, except this time, the one who stepped in was someone who had once been mistreated himself and still chose forgiveness. Richard stood in silence. Charles gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Someone like that deserves more second tables in this world. In a quiet corner, Jonathan Price, the renowned food critic, sat scribbling notes into his leather-bound journal. This time, it wasn't a review of cuisine, no poetic description of sauces, no analysis of French bread crusts. This time, he wrote about a test of dignity beneath crystal chandeliers, a lost server given the chance to find his moral compass, a leader who chose not to punish with power, but to guide with grace. He looked up toward the door where Marcus had just exited. "I'll write the full story," he murmured. "Not just for the restaurant, but for anyone out there wondering, can I really change?" The answer is yes. Marcus's transformation didn't just save a job, it saved the gaze of those who had once looked at the world through the wrong lens. Aurora, once merely a symbol of high-class dining, became something else that night. It became the city's largest classroom, a place where every guest, every employee, and every bystander had to relearn an old lesson: no one has the right to define another person based on a first glance. That night, as the final lights inside Aurora Fine Dining dimmed, not a single person left the restaurant the same as when they'd entered. Not because of the food, not because of the wine, but because they had just witnessed something rare in the modern world: forgiveness without condition and a second chance offered through faith, not power. In the fading light, Charles Wynne stepped closer to Gabriel Hart, who now stood alone near the door that led to the kitchen where it had all begun. "Gabriel," Charles called out, his voice low and steady. "I have a proposal." Gabriel turned, his gaze still soft as wind but deep as the ocean floor. "I'm listening." Charles reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a signed check, placing it gently on the nearby counter. "I'd like to fund the full operational costs for Second Table for at least the next 3 years. Gabriel stood in silence for a few seconds, not out of surprise, but because he understood something. Charles wasn't doing this to impress anyone. He was doing it for himself. "You don't have to do this, Charles," Gabriel said softly. "Second Table doesn't accept flashy donations." Charles smiled a smile that held something deeply human. "This isn't a donation. This is giving back." He lightly touched the edge of the check, his eyes drifting into the distance. "I was once a kid without a suit to get into a restaurant. I was thrown out of a place just like Aurora back when I was starting out. I still remember the feeling of being shoved out the door by a security guard like garbage, and I swore, if I ever had the means, I'd help build a place where no one's value was questioned because of the clothes they wore." Gabriel didn't speak. He simply looked at the older man in front of him as if he'd just discovered a former version of Marcus, one who had awakened just in time. Charles nodded. "Use this money to open another table, another kitchen, another seat for someone who's been left out." Gabriel nodded gently. "I promise. The following week, at Second Table." Marcus returned not as someone being punished, but as someone leading a new group of volunteers. He taught them how to listen instead of rushing to judge, how to serve with their eyes, not just their hands, how to place a tray of bread down with both hands as if offering kindness, not just food. And when a homeless guest asked him, "Where did you used to work?" Marcus simply smiled. "A place that taught me never to judge someone by a first look, That evening, Gabriel jotted a few quiet lines into his notebook. In this world, anyone can become a Marcus, someone who once got it wrong, someone who once mistook pride for purpose, someone who hurt others without knowing. But with the right chance, anyone can become better. And sometimes the thing that changes a person isn't a rebuke, but the quiet belief that they deserve a chance to make things right. In a world where we're taught that worth lies in appearance, job titles, and bank balances, remember this: dignity doesn't have a dress code. Kindness requires no conditions, and change is real if someone's willing to believe long enough. The story of Marcus Denton isn't about a man who fell. It's about a man who was lifted. When the lights at Aurora dimmed and the clinking of glasses faded into memory, what remained wasn't the aftertaste of fine food or the richness of vintage wine. It was a question echoing in the hearts of those who witnessed that night. Have I ever looked at someone the way Marcus did? Gabriel Hart never had to raise his voice, never had to fire anyone, never had to prove he was the owner, because he understood true power doesn't lie in authority. It lies in how we choose to treat those who can do nothing for us. And Marcus Denton, the man who once mocked simplicity, dismissed kindness, became the one who made all of us reflect. Not because he failed, but because he dared to learn again, to relearn how to listen, to relearn how to see others not through what they wear, but through their eyes, their story, their silence that sometimes speaks louder than words. To relearn humility, something no school can teach, but life never stops testing. This story isn't just about a restaurant or a waiter or an undercover boss. This story is about all of us. Because how many times have we judged someone just because they didn't drive a luxury car, avoided eye contact with a person who didn't fit in with the setting, or worse, stayed silent while someone else was being humiliated, believing it wasn't our problem? But what if just one action, just one person brave enough to speak up, just one timely chance could save an entire life? Then why not start with ourselves? If this story made you pause, made you reflect on a moment where you may have judged too quickly, share this video with someone who needs the reminder. No one is worthless sometimes. They've just never been truly seen. And if you've ever met someone like Gabriel, someone who quietly does what's right without needing the spotlight, drop their name in the comments. Send them a thank you. Because who knows, your words of gratitude might be exactly what they need on a day when no one else sees them. Or, if you have ever been like Marcus, someone who got it wrong, who let pride speak too loudly, who hurt others without realizing it, we're not here to judge. Because what makes you worthy is that you're still here today and you're choosing to relearn how to be human. Subscribe to True Rank Stories so you don't miss the stories that help us all slow down and live deeper. Because sometimes the last seat in a restaurant is really the first step to an entirely new life. Bucky.